Thanks very much for coming to this session, which is a bit of an anomaly. It's a bit heretical because there is so much information around psychedelic-assisted therapy, as we know. So basically, if you've got particularly a mental health problem, like depression or whatever else it might be, psychedelics are being touted as the way to help. And definitely we've had a number of sessions on that very topic. However, psychedelics are also great for people who don't have problems and, or serious medical problems, and who might simply want to explore the betterment of themselves. And in some ways, that's probably what a lot of people have been using psychedelics for many years. And so thank you very much to Dr. Martin Williams, who's going to come and talk to us about that. And Martin is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Mental Health in Swinburne University, and he's also been a co-investigator on a number of Australian clinical trials for psychedelic-assisted therapy. So he has a huge amount of experience and knowledge in that domain. And Martin is also the founding member and volunteering supporter for Entheogenesis Australis, which is a major group that's been running for over 20 years now on basically all things psychedelic and plant-based. And also, Martin is also the founder of a group called Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine in Australia. So thank you very much, Martin, for getting up early to share this wonderful and exciting news with us.
Thanks very much for having me, Kath. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everybody for being here, and of course I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on the lands of the Bundjalung people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to acknowledge anybody from the First Nations people who are here in this meeting today. So yeah, Kath summed things up pretty well in terms of the sort of the general history of psychedelic research in recent times in particular has been focused on the treatment of mental health conditions and the use of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy specifically for the treatment of certain mood disorders, particularly depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder and some other sort of mood disorders which tend to be related to a kind of rigidification or a sort of a calcification of our thought processes and our belief systems and so on and so forth. And it appears at this stage that the evidence is strongly in favour of psychedelic-assisted therapies as alternative and novel and effective treatments for some of these otherwise quite difficult to treat mental health conditions. But today I'm going to be speaking about another aspect of psychedelics which is pretty close to my heart. That psychedelics have a long history, of course, of human use, and that they have not always been used by any means for the treatment of pathology, psychopathologies or mental health conditions. And so the theme of my talk today will be the application of psychedelics and psychedelic therapies, and I'm sort of putting inverted commas around that term for what we call the betterment of well people. And so there are three sort of questions or four questions which arise from that particular title. I'll explain in the first instance what sort of medicalisation entails and then how we could move beyond that and how that's of course not the only model of mental health management. I'm not talking about mental health treatment, which is what medicalisation is about, but more the management of positive mental health. So medicalisation, as many people will be aware in the context of psychedelics, has been the application of psychedelic therapies within a clinical model and essentially applying what we regard as the Western medical paradigm to the treatment of something that we regard as a negative condition. Psychedelics, in this particular context, I'm defining primarily as the classic psychedelics. So by classic psychedelics, we mean those particular psychedelic compounds which act at a certain subset of receptors in our brain, serotonin receptors, and classic examples of those, of course, are psilocybin, which is the active constituent in magic mushrooms. I'm sure everybody is aware of that now. LSD, mescaline, which is an active constituent, psychoactive constituent in certain species of cactus, and a number of others, DMT and some others, many of which are natural products, which have a long history of human use. Others are much more recent and are still in the process of development in a clinical and medical sort of sense. As far as Betterment is concerned, I think everybody probably has their own conception of what Betterment might be. And in fact, I would distinguish in the context of this talk between the betterment as perceived by the individual compared with the betterment as perceived by the community and society. And those two things don't necessarily correspond perfectly together. And then the next, so I'll try and sort of tiptoe around that sort of distinction to a degree and maybe discuss it a little bit as we move along. And then finally, who are actually well people? One thing that we need to consider is that essentially that the idea of a mental health spectrum, I think, is very appropriate and relevant in this particular case. And so in a way, we're all well in our own way. We're all unwell in our own way. We all carry the sort of the burdens of just everyday life, of just being human and living in an interesting, complex, and increasingly challenging world. But for all that said, I think there's a medical distinction between well, unwell. I think that in many cases is arbitrary, but I do think that it's a useful sort of concept at this for the purposes of this particular discussion. One thing I should add parenthetically is that I'm sort of riffing on a few ideas today, so excuse me if it's not everything is perfectly sort of clear. Very, very happy as we move along to discuss and to try and clarify and unpick some of these ideas. But I thought they're worth sharing and putting out there anyway, so we'll see how we go. So with those sort of, I don't know, some sort of clarification or some sort of definition in place, then hopefully that sets the scene for the next half hour or so of chat. It's probably easier if people hold questions to the end of the chat, if that's okay, and then I'll leave about 15-20 minutes, I think, if all goes well, to answer questions and to open up a bit of a discussion if that's appropriate. So just back to this medical model, this is a gross oversimplification, of course, but in essence, the Western medical model, which has sort of evolved from the middle of the last century, from the 1950s and 60s onwards, and then has really been refined towards the last quarter of the 20th century, was that clinical trials are the sort of the first step in achieving registration and approval and general sort of acceptance of certain medicines. In most cases, of course, those medicines are developed by pharmaceutical companies, and they are usually the result of very targeted and specific drug discovery programs. What we have, of course, on the other hand, are many natural products, which are some of which are well recognised as medicines, and I would argue that cannabis is certainly, and cannabinoids are certainly in that group, but there's still scope and there's still ongoing work researching natural product medicines. But for the time being, I think we can accept that the majority of medicines that are coming onto market are still developed by an industry focused on that development. Once medicines are approved, following an appropriate accumulation of evidence in favour of those medicines, then they can be approved and applied to the treatment of, in our case, mental health conditions. I'll go back a little bit in terms of history and say that, in fact, psychedelics had been explored from the discovery of the effects of LSD from 1943 by Albert Hofmann in Switzerland onwards. Through the 50s and early 60s, they were utilised extensively in clinical applications. So psychedelics were considered something of a new frontier in psychiatry. They basically came in at a time when our understanding of brain processes and the mind to a certain degree was still in sort of their formative stages. And so we can say quite comfortably that psychedelics contributed substantially to our understanding of how the brain works in terms of neurological processes, and particularly in the context of receptor and neurotransmission sort of concepts. But then very close to and just following that time, there was a very significant movement in the counterculture, as few people might actually remember, but many people are aware, I'm sure. But there were many attitudes and behaviours which are associated with the counterculture, which we would be interested to consider in terms of some of the benefits of the psychedelic sort of space or the mindset. And those, of course, include the concepts of nature relatedness and environmental awareness that I'll be exploring a little bit later in this talk. So there's a distinction, of course, between anecdotal evidence and research evidence, and we could argue the merits of one or the other or both at great length, but I won't go into any particular detail here. But of course we can point to the experiences of hundreds of thousands, if not millions and millions of people that would attest to the benefits of psychedelics and psychedelic experiences for their general sort of sense of well-being. And in many cases, there's their own personal sense of their own journey and their healing journey. And so this is where I think that sort of distinction between well people and unwell people becomes very blurry, because I'd say everybody in the room probably has a story to tell in terms of how they felt at a particular time and how their mood and their general state of being was significantly improved by the input of some particular either medication, psychedelic, cannabis, or even just a mindfulness kind of activity. So all of these come into play, and I think they're all very closely interlinked to a large degree. On the other hand, if we're talking about formal research, then of course there are many and several different sort of approaches and levels to research. So when we're talking about studies of naturalistic use, then naturalistic use is essentially the voluntary use of a particular, for example, a psychedelic by people who are not formally enrolled in research studies. But those sort of studies tend to be administered through, nowadays through online questionnaires and responses, and previously they were generally just by interview and questionnaire. But there's one interesting paper which came through, and I'll refer to this a little bit later, which noted that some of these large population studies in the past have demonstrated that psychedelic use in the wild tends to be associated, and by associated I'm using that term very specifically, with significant benefits in terms of mental health manifestations. So suicidal rates and psychological distress are things that we can sort of measure objectively. And those have been demonstrated over extended research to benefit from the naturalistic use, the voluntary per choice use of psychedelics by people just in the general population. Now we can probably, we need to sort of take a step back and say, okay, well, people who self-administer psychedelics may or may not be in mental good health. Some people may have some mental health difficulties. Some people who have mental health difficulties may gravitate towards and what we call self-medicate with psychedelics. That has to be taken as something of a given. But nonetheless, I think it's very useful to look at these kinds of population studies, accept that there'll be significant variations in the mental health makeup or fabric of those people, of that population. And then sort of make whatever conclusions that we feel are appropriate and responsibly appropriate to that data set. Now, this particular paper goes on to say that historically there is the evidence that within certain groups of people, certain communities, then those people who use psychedelics still score or do score quite well and positively in some of these key attributes. So confidence, optimism, general sense of well-being. there's also sort of the tip over into the embracing of spiritual or mystical beliefs. Mystical tends to be the word we use nowadays. But also that sort of sense of connectedness and caring. What we're talking about is concern for others and our sort of connectedness to the environment and to nature. And those in this particular study, the one that I'm referring to at the end of this slide, compared psychedelics to individuals who use cannabis, strangely enough, amphetamine or heroin. So these are, as I say, large statistical studies. So these are the results that have come through from those particular studies. I should also always add the caveat that most research studies have a particular agenda, they have a particular set of research questions to answer, and those research questions are based on the interests of the researchers themselves. So in many cases, and probably more than we'd be comfortable with, then research sometimes, or research often, answers the questions in the affirmative that the researchers are hoping to answer. So just always hold that in the back of your mind as well. So one of the particular studies, and I'm sort of moving into what we call the current sort of wave, the psychedelic renaissance, or this sort of third wave of psychedelic research, really sort of commenced with a study at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, in Maryland, in the US. And interestingly enough, although there's been a very significant and noteworthy move towards the use of psychedelic-assisted therapies for the treatment of mental health conditions, the study that really kicked this recent movement off, was the study by Roland Griffiths and supported by Bob Jesse of the Council for Spiritual Practice at Johns Hopkins University. And this study looked at the administration of a solid, what we'd regard nowadays as a solid dose of psilocybin, so 25 milligrams, in fact 30 milligrams per 70 milligram adult. Yeah, that's a small person. 70 kilogram adult, and so as that is a standard dose, then it was found that the people who volunteered for the study and who actually had a history of spiritual or religious practice themselves, so that was a selection criterion, they did rate that reasonably robust, strong psilocybin experience as having great personal meaning and also being one of the most significant experiences of their lives. And this sort of replicated in some ways a study that was completed in 1962, I believe, at the Harvard Chapel at Harvard University, which studied the effects of psilocybin on spirituality in people who were training to become ministers of religion. And so I have to sort of provide that caveat that this was a carefully selected group of participants, but nonetheless it did reinforce their attitudes and behaviour. I'll sort of touch on this reinforcement of attitudes and behaviour a little bit later, because I think that's something that we need to be aware of and be concerned about in terms of drawing some of the conclusions that I will probably draw anyway a little bit later. Another study that was quite interesting was an observational study of naturalistic psychedelic users. So again, these people had voluntarily used psychedelics in their own homes or in their own environments. They weren't administered those in a clinical trial, but they did respond to an online questionnaire, and the questions that they answered generally related to two particular personality traits, so openness and conscientiousness, which are two of the what they call the big five personality traits. Nature relatedness, which is a particular interest to my work at the moment, and political attitudes. It's a very simple sort of measure, that particular one, so relatively straightforward, but it's interesting to draw some sort of inferences from this study. Now, openness in this particular case, and this is fairly important, really encompasses those three sort of key sort of parameters that you can see up here. So aesthetic appreciation, sensitivity, fantasy, imagination, visualization, but also, most importantly, probably the tolerance of other people's values, beliefs, viewpoints, and so on. And so I think, for better or worse, this is the sort of the definition of openness that we're looking at here. But I think it's still a pretty useful sort of working concept in terms of assessing people's capacity to interact and to accommodate and to learn and to potentially to change their own belief systems in response to evidence, sensory evidence. I've got a beautiful looking coffee here and I'm just going to have a quick sip. Thanks, Lee. So one thing we do need to keep in mind, of course, is that the studies have looked at the association between psychedelic use and belief systems and nature relatedness and a number of other parameters. But at this stage, we still have very little evidence that psychedelic use can actually change people's established beliefs. Now, there's certainly some contention around that, and in fact, that paper that I'm referring to, and this is the Noor et al. And Robin Carhart-Harris paper from 2017, does still sort of point towards the capacity of psychedelics to change or alter people's belief systems after the age of 30, for example, which seems to be considered, as I understand it, a bit of a sort of a threshold for sort of the establishment of belief systems and viewpoints and behaviours. But nonetheless, I think it needs to be acknowledged that at this stage we still don't have strong evidence that people could be turned from a complete arsehole into an absolute angel sort of overnight through a psychedelic experience. Some people perhaps, but that is probably in the minority given the lack of evidence that we have so far. Now, one parameter of let's see, of behaviour, viewpoint behaviour and potential behavioural change is what we call nature relatedness. And that is that sort of connectedness to nature, the world around us, and actually to people around us as well. And that is considered to be something of a marker of the mystical type experience. And again, I'll go back to the point that mystical experience is considered something of a marker in turn of an effective, strong psychedelic experience. So in positive, appropriate circumstances, it does appear that classic psychedelics can induce experiences that bring about a shift in perspective and hence the development of connectedness to nature and concomitant environmental virtues. And specifically you can see this respect for nature, the sense of awe, and environmental humility, which essentially means our sense of being small in the context of a much larger universe. How would this come about? Well, it's hypothesized at least that ego dissolution, or the loss of that boundary between the self and the surroundings, leads to that sort of sense of connection and, in many cases, that identification with nature. As far as the mechanistic sort of nuts and bolts of the process, I guess we can hypothesize that in fact the reasonably well-established mechanisms of action in the clinical and therapeutic context probably apply in the case of people who don't experience or are not currently experiencing significant mental ill health. And so we can generally point to the observation of a dose-dependent effect of psychedelics on the elicitation or precipitation of mystical experiences. There's a similar sort of dose dependence in terms of the neurological processes of shifting, changing, in some ways enhancing and in other ways quietening down aspects of what we call functional connectivity of the various sort of subregions, the networks within our brain. And then also, interestingly enough, there's been in separate studies, and some of those are preclinical, in other words, looking at cells in a dish and rodent models, but non-human models. It's been observed that psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, DMT, DOI, which is a classic, very interesting psychedelic amphetamine, which has been used extensively in neuro research, can have significant effects on neuroplasticity, or the regeneration of neural connections which in many cases are thought to be lost in the course of mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and other mood disorders. It has to be noted, of course, that these are not immediate effects of the psychedelics, but they generally take place over a period of sort of a few days to a few weeks. The reason for that is that psychedelics seem to modulate certain neurohormonal processes involving certain other receptors, certain neurohormones, and so these sort of cascades take a while to play out. Now, one thing I also wanted to stress, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that mental health isn't just a binary. It's not just you're in good health or you're in bad health. It's just the full spectrum. And so we do need to acknowledge that there's always this broad spectrum of mental health. And so we should at least sort of keep that in the back of our minds when we're talking about the betterment of anybody, let alone well people. So I'll just speak briefly about a couple of studies which we've either undertaken or are planning here in Australia. And it's been a great privilege for me to be involved in some of this psychedelic research, and there's more in the pipeline, I'm happy to say. So the MardiGrass study started just around the pandemic. We had a bit of a quiet year, as a lot of people did, but then we really got things rolling in 2021, and we selected people who did not have any significant ill health conditions as detectable by some of the standard sort of psychological questionnaires, the SCID in particular, the standard clinical interview for diagnostic DSM disorders. So essentially we dosed a cohort of participants who were in mental good health with 19 milligrams, so that's considered to be a 3/4 full therapeutic dose, which still pretty reliably, except in me as the pilot unfortunately, did elicit a significant psychedelic experience. Half of those participants were provided with mindfulness meditation, a course of mindfulness meditation training, and the other half were basically just thrown into it without that meditation training. We were very interested to see in particular whether the meditation training enabled or assisted people to negotiate or encounter their sort of psychedelic experience and to address potentially some of the challenges. Probably the greatest challenge was sticking people in an MRI scanner and bombarding them with very loud noises and radio frequency radiation for 50 minutes at a time. So most of the people sailed through that, but not everybody did. So we were interested in looking at the absolute sort of at the molecular scale, brain function and changes in brain function between the baseline. So we stuck people in scanners and before administering psilocybin, and then a week or so later gave them the psilocybin, stuck them in the scanner. Did an EEG as well, which is a much more gentle but still rather irritating process of looking at brain function. But also significantly from the context of this particular 5 minutes, what the hell? 5 minutes, I actually have 5 minutes to go, so that's good. So we were looking importantly at these two approaches to assessing quality of life. So that's the World Health Organization's quality of life scale, and the other one, I can't remember what that acronym is, so don't worry about that. But also appreciation of music before and after the psilocybin experience. The results are still in process, so we'll be publishing those before too long. So, it's complex, very interesting. But at least in my mind it was a very useful study of psychedelics and their potential sort of changes in people's state of mind, their quality of life and so on. The other one is, this is one study that's in the pipeline, so we're just getting that through ethics at the moment. But it's a study specifically of psilocybin in the context of a guided experience, which we're sort of saying is a supported experience, not a therapeutic input as such. But the effects of psilocybin with guidance from guides on these parameters of nature relatedness specifically, the quality of life aspects that I mentioned earlier, cognitive flexibility and openness, which are those sort of concepts that we have discussed already. But specifically, in the context of nature relatedness, we're looking at that sort of awareness and concern about climate change and environment, and potentially, although this is not necessarily going to end up in the study, the willingness to donate, to actually convert thought to action and to donate to environmental causes. So I'll just finish by giving you a bit of an idea of, I thought it might be useful just to provide my own sort of conception of a model of beyond medicalisation, not BMWs. And so I think from my perspective, if we are to take this forward and to look at the ongoing sort of development of an approach to improving bettering the life of well people generally, then we need to pay strong attention, of course, to the classic sort of well-established considerations in psychedelic work. So in this particular case, we're looking for mental good health in people and essentially steering people who might have significant psychological pathologies into a treatment program rather than this sort of mental good health sort of model. But careful preparation, of course, is almost a given nowadays in any psychedelic work. The facilitator really needs to be experienced and able to support, provide guidance if required, but not to provide guidance as a fundamental or a priori part of the approach. The environment, and particularly we're going to be studying this in this nature connectedness study, ideally should be quiet and in a natural setting, and I've just thrown trees and water in there, but pretty much sort of plug in whatever sort of particular personal favourite or interest or something that'll make people feel settled and calm, and that should be determined and established before the process starts. Music is optional but probably desirable. The style of the music is by preference, and in fact that's been a significant limitation, I feel, of some of the mental health treatment studies so far, is that quite often the music provided during therapy is actually more reflecting of the tastes and outlook of the researchers rather than the participant themselves. And the music should not be aimed at directing the experience. There should also be a repeat button, so that, I don't know, somebody I met once actually played the same tune about 10 times in a session. The drug itself needs to be appropriate to the individual. So I spoke last night about beyond psilocybin. There's something of a fixation of psilocybin, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there's so much more. There's a whole galaxy of psychedelics to explore in terms of not only therapeutic application, but also the betterment of well people. And there's a horses for courses sort of aspect to that. Appropriate dose, an appropriate source, appropriate to the person who's going to be taking the experience, as well as the people around them. And then as far as frequency is concerned, then I regard this as something of a mental health maintenance program. So it's a bit like taking a car to the workshop once a year for its annual checkup and its grease and oil change and so on. Not necessarily to repair damage, but just to keep things in good health. So apart from reiterating the rinse and repeat, I think integration is also a very important aspect of, as we all know, in terms of psychotherapeutic use of psychedelics, and I think that really should be applicable to the use of psychedelics consciously, responsibly, and deliberately in the maintenance of good mental health. So thanks very much for your rapt attention, and any questions, come along.
Thank you, Martin. We do have a few roaming mics if there's any questions. Otherwise, you're very welcome to chat to Martin personally afterwards. You'll be hanging around generally in the mud. Yep. Okay, thanks so much for coming for this early talk. Thank you. Thanks so much, Martin.